Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with your boy, Mr. Ancharsky. So this is going to be our first chapter in Unit 2 about how is trade impacting Europe. And we're going to look especially at how trade is impacting the natural environment of Europe. And the prime example of what we'll talk about to demonstrate that is the Black Death. Because the Black Death is going to be a hugely important natural phenomenon that is going to initiate a lot of changes in European society. But how does the Black Death, this major disease, get to Europe? Well, through trade, as we're going to see in today, as we're going to see in just a second. They'll work on the screen. And yes, this is going to be all about this idea of the rebirth of economic transactions like trade in Western Europe or the Latin West. So today we're going to look at the end of the end of the Middle Ages, known as the High or Late Middle Ages. And especially we're paying attention to economic and political changes that happen as a result of the spread of the Black Death. So don't pay attention to that. So the lesson objective today is about how we see environmental impacts of various networks of exchange in Afro-Eurasia. So really, I'm kind of giving you what you should talk about in that daily summary just off the bat. You should talk about how the networks of exchange that Europe has between Africa and Asia, how these networks of exchange bring in new technologies that impacts the environment through agricultural production and through deforestation, as well as we'll see in a second. But also, these trade networks are bringing in disease as well. So pay attention to examples of how the environment is impacting European society and how trade might have impacted those environmental effects. So we're going to first look at some environmental changes going on by the end of the Middle Ages. Let's take a look at those. But before that, just a little bit of review, a refresher, you could say, from Unit 1. So just to kind of define where we're talking about, we are largely going to focus on Western Europe. So that includes places like England, France, Spain, Northern Italy, the Italian city-states. We'll also look at Northwest Europe. We're not talking about Russia today. So if you like talking about Russia, that's not your day today. So the Latin West is going to define the Catholic parts of Western Europe. So places like England, France, and Spain, for example. And in Unit 1, we discussed kind of this idea of the Middle Ages, especially of the early Middle Ages. And remember, the early Middle Ages was a time period of decentralization. We largely do see that compared to places like China, Europe is a mess, to put it kind of very simplistically. It's very fragmented. There is a lot of political entities based on this system of feudalism. So we see a lot of political decentralization. We see feudalism, economically speaking. We have manorialism. We have serfdom. And that's just a very important thing to remember, that slavery it exists still in Western Europe, but it is not the dominant form of labor relations. What is serfdom. And that's going to be true-ish for the late Middle Ages as well. But the early Middle Ages is a time period of economic and political decentralization. But as we're going to see today, the end of the Middle Ages, we start to see a slow process towards economic and political centralization. And I'm saying a very slow process because it is one. We are going to still see some remnants of feudalism, but we start to see cracks in these traditional medieval institutions emerge that will eventually fall apart by the Renaissance, and as we'll talk about much later on, the French Revolution as well, the end of the nobility, basically, in Europe. But anyway, the late Middle Ages, or High Middle Ages, as they're sometimes called, is going to be a time period of increased trade. So that's a big change. So I'm emphasizing a change here. A big change is we start to see more of a focus on trade in addition to agricultural production. So trade is increasing. Europe is connected to, say, the Muslim world thanks to these improved trade networks. And we also see that there will be tech advancements in the realm of agriculture, of manufacturing, and of course, military technology as well. But what is changing in terms of agriculture? Well, a few things are actually. For one thing, we are going to see that generally around the world, but especially in Western Europe, that in the medieval warm period, we generally have warmer global temperatures. And warmer temperatures are going to allow for a flourishing of crop production. So the medieval warm period is going to be a time period in which we have better conditions for agriculture. And in conjunction, in combination with improved technology and improved agricultural practices, we are going to see a huge explosion in food production. But let's look at the technological aspect of all of this. So, better climate conditions, meaning that we have better food production conditions. But in terms of technology, let's take a look at some of these ideas being introduced into Europe thanks to trade. So let's first look at the mold board. The mold board is a type of plow, basically. And you can kind of see a picture of that plow in medieval art style right here. Medieval art, very 2D, it lacks perspective, very, I want to say simplistic, but it is kind of less realistic than, say, what we'll talk about with the Renaissance. So we have the mold board. That's one example of a agricultural technology, a type of plow. It's pulled by horses and cattle. And speaking of horses, actually, we are going to see the introduction of horseback technology, things like stirrups and collars. These things are coming into Europe thanks to their inclusion in Silk Road trade, for example. Remember, Central Asian nomads, they're pioneering these horseback technologies, and eventually these technologies make their way across Eurasia. And they're going to have an impact on agriculture because we do see a improved use of horses and cattle in helping with food production, especially pulling plows. So, excellent. We now have the use of beasts of burden in agriculture. That's so cool, isn't it? But we also do see that agricultural practices are being introduced into European society that will generally help food production. So, for example, we have the three field system, essentially kind of a three-field system, a village in Western Europe. There would be three fields, as the name might suggest. Two fields for one season would grow wheat or barley, and then the third field would be a place for, say, grazing for sheep. And then after the harvest, we would shift what field grows what. So it's essentially that idea of crop rotation. It's a way to ensure nutrients are replenished, and that's actually going to help increase food production. So we are going to see, because of warmer temperatures, because of new practices, new technologies, we do see an increase of food production. And in general, in AP World History, better agriculture means more food means more people means urbanization. This is going to be a general rule we'll talk about a lot, actually, in this class, and something you might be familiar with already. But in terms of other technologies that are impacting the economy of Western Europe, we are going to see that from the Muslim world, a lot of these technologies coming from the Muslim world in general, we are going to start to see the incorporation of new technologies like the water wheel, like windmills. So we do kind of see the use of these new technologies pioneered across the Middle East into Western Europe. So, for example, we have the water wheel, and essentially a water wheel kind of goes against the current in kind of rotating a wheel around, basically. And then a windmill, it's the wind that they're rotating. That's me next to a windmill right there, actually. Yeah. So, what are these mills and water wheels actually used for? Well, they are going to be used in a kind of early form of manufacturing. So, we start to see that with the inclusion of these new technologies that allow for manufacturing, we start to see that that's a small part, a new but small part of the European economy. So we primarily see this manufacturing in the form of lumber kind of processing, of cutting timber into into boards of wood that can be used in construction. That's one kind of manufacturing that we're seeing. We also see that there is kind of this grain mill idea, the idea of using the wind, using water wheels, using animal power as well to produce flour, using kind of grinding stones. So this is a form of manufacturing in a way. It is going to be an early form of manufacturing, but we also do see that there's better kind of mining product, there's better mining, there's better processing of iron and metal into tools. So all of these things are going on by the end of the Middle Ages, thanks to this new technology of the mill and the water wheel. But it's still important to remember that Europe is not, no place really, isn't, no place is not, no place is an industrialized place. That's very important to understand. That while we do start to see this introduction of something in the economy other than agriculture, it's still important to remember Europe is not the dominant manufacturer in world history, even at this time. The dominant manufacturer are societies in East Asia, especially China. China, remember, is very prominent in the production of ceramics, of textiles, and that is actually going to be the case. East Asia will dominate manufacturing really until the 1750s. And that is what we'll talk about with the Industrial Revolution later on in Unit 5, actually. However, all of these new technologies, all of this improved agriculture, this introduction of manufacturing, this is going to lead to, guess what, environmental devastation. We are going to see that these technologies, these new technologies acquired through trade, their overuse, you could say, will devastate the natural environment. For example, with all of these lumber mills popping up, we see a lot of deforestation. England, for example, is going to be basically eradicated of all of its wilderness, of all of its trees and whatnot. But what is the impact of this improved agricultural production and this introduction of manufacturing? Well, a few fold. For one thing, better agriculture means more food means more people means urbanization. We do start to see a reversal of a general trend in the Middle Ages for rural communities. We start to see people slowly but surely coming into cities. We do see kind of the return of urbanized societies in Western Europe by the end of the Middle Ages. And yet, that is kind of problematic in a way because these urban workers, these newly kind of entering into urban society workers, they're going to face a lot of competition in the job market. There are too many laborers, and as such, their value is a lot less, is significantly low. So we do see that oftentimes in urban places that we have very low wages. And then just kind of as a side note, just a clarification right now, when you're a peasant, when you're a serf, you're not paid like a wage. You're paid in like protection and the use and the ability to use land. So a wage worker is someone who is able in a way to choose their employer and they are getting money in exchange for their work. It's what we would understand as a job today. And this is actually something that is starting to pop up by the end of the Middle Ages. And we see that with this urbanization, people are not becoming farmers anymore, and they're moving into cities. They're taking instead wage working jobs. So, in terms of the environment and its impact on that, all of this agricultural and manufacturing beginnings, we do start to see kind of devastation. We see deforestation. We see runoff of pollution from mines and these early kind of iron production facilities. And yet there is kind of a positive aspect to all of this because with this improvement of agricultural yields, we do start to see that peasants, they can sell some of their side goods to make a little bit of money so that they can get some money for themselves that they don't need to okay, let me explain this again. So serfs, peasants, they have to produce a certain amount of crops for their landlord, right? However, if you kind of produce more than is required of you, you can sell that side stuff for money. So we do start to see that there is this kind of ability of some farmers, of some peasants, to sell their products. And then there is a lot more financial freedom for at least some peasants in Western Europe because of these improved agricultural yields. So there are some good things, I guess. But as we're going to see in a second, that problem of too many workers and very low wages is going to be solved by a massive depopulation in the Black Death. So the Black Death is something that we've been dancing around the edges. It is going to be a major outbreak of the bubonic plague within much of, Afro-Eurasia in this time period between 1346 and 1353. And we're going to look at mostly the impact of the Black Death on Europe, but it does take place across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Well, mostly North Africa, mostly Europe, and then some parts of Asia. So what is the Black Death before we look at some causes? Well, the Black Death is kind of an outbreak of the bubonic plague. So we are going to see that in this time period, in the mid 1300s, which are very mid in a way, we are going to see this outbreak of disease, of the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague is a highly contagious disease. It's spread through bacteria found on fleas, which are found on rats. And oftentimes these rats are going into very crowded urban centers. And we do see that there will be spread of disease, especially in these very stinky cities. And I say stinky quite literally because Europeans didn't really bathe at this point. That wasn't kind of considered acceptable practice. Who knows why? Well, anyway. So the bubonic plague, it is this highly transmissible disease. The body breaks out into buboes, which are boils. You can kind of see that in this lower image right here. It's called the Black Death because oftentimes people's fingers, their phalanges, see, I pay attention in biology, their phalanges kind of are going to become darkened, they become blackened, and then you die. So it's a highly contagious, highly, with a high mortality type of disease. But why is it going to spread the way it does across the world, and especially in Europe? Well, for one thing, we are going to see that as a kind of reversal of that warm period, that medieval warm period, we are going to see global temperatures actually cool off significantly during the Little Ice Age. My Little Ice Age. It's a MGMT reference. Anyway, so we do see a decrease in the climate, a decrease in global temperatures during the Little Ice Age, which itself is going to impact food production. There's less food, so that's going to kind of leave peasants, especially in a lot weaker state. Malnutrition is common amongst most people, and there's not going to be strong immune systems to resist this disease. In Europe, for example, we see the Great Famine in the early 1300s. This is going to weaken immune systems to fight infection. But we also see that the Black Death will happen mostly because diseases are spread through the movement of people and the movement of rats. So we do see that kind of one of the big impacts of improved Silk Road travel is going to lead to the outbreak of disease. So we do actually see that merchants, probably from Central Asia, more than likely kind of initiated, or well, they didn't obviously initiate the Black Death, but they came into contact with it first in Central Asia. And eventually, because of this economic cohesion, economic unity in Europe and Asia, we do see the spread of this disease towards people in across Europe and Asia because of these travelings of people along the Silk Road. We also see that the movement of people in other ways also contributes to disease. We see that the Mongols, for example, unified Europe and Asia to allow for safer trade travel. And this is going to lead to the spread of disease. People are moving around a lot during wars, in case you didn't realize. So we do see actually that the Mongols will help create the conditions for the Black Death. Arguably, some historians have said they intentionally infected people in Crimea with the Black Death. And eventually, kind of thanks to trade networks, we do see that from the Middle East, especially the introduction of the Black Death, of the bubonic plague, I should say, into Italy. From there, it's spreading into the rest of Europe. And then there's this helpful TED Ed video. We're not going to watch it. But what's the impact of the Black Death? Because this is probably the most important thing from this presentation. If anything, this is what would be on your Unit 2 test. So what is the impact of the Black Death? Well, a few things. For one thing, in general, the Black Death is going to contribute actually to a huge loss of population across Africa, Europe, and Asia. So generally, during the period before the Black Death, while the Silk Road was flourishing, we saw urbanization, we saw a general increase in global populations. But because of the Black Death, we kind of see that stalling, at least for a little bit in world history until the 1500s. So we are going to see kind of a lot of depopulation in places like the Middle East, but Europe is going to be the hardest hit, as we're going to see in a second. So the global impact of the Black Death is estimated anywhere between 75 million and 200 million. I probably lean towards the smaller number there, but that's still a lot of people dead from the disease. So we do see that the world will be impacted by it, at least Africa, Europe, and Asia. But Europe arguably is the hardest hit. About 1/3 of Europe's population, in some communities almost 2/3, are going to die as a result of the Black Death. But what is the cultural impact of all these people dying from the Black Death? Well, let's look at a few things. In terms of religion, especially in Europe, we do see that people are appealing towards religion as an explanation for the terribleness of the Black Death. So we see on the one hand that people are going to view the Black Death as a punishment from God, that God was mad at humanity for some reason and decided to curse them with the Black Death. And some people are going to approach this subject and they're going to say, oh my God, we did something wrong. We need to punish ourselves so that God becomes happy again. And this actually manifests in the form of self-flagellation, which is essentially publicly whipping yourself. However, despite the fact that a lot of people are appealing to religion as an explanation for the natural world, we are also going to see at the same time that the Catholic Church is going to come under serious questioning. Because while all of these people are dying, the Catholic Church seemingly is doing nothing, successfully anyway, to prevent all of this. So we do kind of see some cracks forming where people start questioning the authority of the Catholic Church, at least in spiritual matters. And this is kind of chipping away at the Catholic Church and will eventually lead to its breakup into different religions by the Protestant Reformation that we'll talk about later. So the cracks starting to form as early as the 1300s. But we also see kind of how wealthy people will respond to the Black Death as well. The Black Death is going to hit urban centers the hardest. We do see that rich people oftentimes will flee the cities, go into the countryside, and they're going to get lit, basically. We do see this increased hedonism, living like there's no tomorrow among Europe's wealthiest populations. But we also see that rich people, especially, are going to patronize art, sponsor art that oftentimes reflects these anxieties about the Black Death and all of this destruction. So we do see this expressed in a variety of different ways. Visual art becomes very morbid, very focused on death. You can see some dancing skeleton boys right here. Thank God skeletons aren't real, am I right? It's Halloween almost. Come on, bear with me. But we also see this in literature as well. For example, Giovanni Boccaccio, he's going to record kind of stories that rich people told each other during their quarantine, basically, in a book called The Decameron. All right. But this is arguably the most important impact of the Black Death, is the impact on economic and social relations within Europe. And one of the biggest impacts of the Black Death is that it's going to lead to the decline of serfdom. Serfdom's not going to end, obviously, because of the Black Death, but it is starting to decline. It is starting to end. And why is the Black Death a cause of the decline of serfdom in Western Europe? Well, it's mostly because a lot of people are dead, especially a lot of urban workers, but more importantly for serfdom, peasant farmers as well. So we do see these massive depopulations of Europe's working class, to use kind of a more modern term, a depopulation of the peasant class. And that means that labor is hard to come by because there is such a massive depopulation. And as such, we start to see that workers are more valuable. They have a lot more ability to kind of choose who they work for. Because if a noble isn't treating them right as a serf, well, guess what? You can find some other way to get a living. You don't need that landlord if they're not going to treat you right. Let's just, if a landlord's not treating you right, don't listen to them. Anyway, and that's going to mean that we have a lot more financial and economic freedom for peasants. So we do start to see that peasants oftentimes are leaving their estates that they have to live on under serfdom. So we do start to see a decline of serfdom because of the increased value of peasant labor. And instead, we do oftentimes see that peasants will either become independent or free farmers, meaning they don't have to kind of listen to a landlord anymore, or if they decide to move to cities for job opportunities, well, we start to see the rise of wage work, that people are entering into employment contracts in which they get a salary in exchange for the work they do. And all of this is going to sound a lot like what the economic system we'll talk about in Unit 4 and Unit 5 will be in Western Europe of capitalism. And yet, nobles aren't going to give up serfdom without a fight. Oftentimes, nobles are going to try and restrict peasants from leaving their estates. And in reaction to this, peasants are going to say, enough is enough, let's kill these nobles that are trying to take away our newfound freedom. And we do see a series of class-based wars across Western Europe. We see a lot of peasant revolts. We have the Jacquerie in France. We have the Peasants' Revolt in England. So we do start to see the people of Western Europe, the peasant class, questioning serfdom, and we do see its steady decline. Serfdom is largely going to be gone in Western Europe by the 1600s, and it's formally abolished in many Western European societies by the French Revolution. But in terms of the impact of the Black Death, we also do see that people will be targeted for their religious and ethnic backgrounds. Oftentimes during crises, we see that people will respond with victim blaming, or well, I guess, but blaming minorities, anybody who isn't considered in the in group, especially non-Christians and and people of ethnic minority status. For example, Jews are blamed for the Black Death. Don't ask me why, but it's obviously falsely accused. But we do see that there will be attacks against Jews from Christians who blame them for the Black Death. We also do see persecution of the Romani or Roma people. The Roma people, they're a semi-nomadic group of people in Western Europe who go from city to city and are often targeted by ruling Christian people because of their nomadic-ish stance on living. And the kind of term you might hear more with the Roma, but is considered offensive by them, is the word gypsy. So don't use that term, use the word Romani or Roma instead. However, the Black Death also has the impact of improving the immunities of many Western Europeans. We do start to see bacterial resistant Europeans from the people who survive the Black Death. Hooray, good job. And luckily, another global pandemic would never, ever, ever happen again. So this video would have shown the kind of the impacts of the Black Death. And then this video would have just been a little bit of a funny. It's Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So you should be able to answer this question right here. How did rural communities develop by the end of the Middle Ages in terms of agriculture and manufacturing? But how did people respond to the Black Death, rich, poor, Christian, etc.? And what are some long-term impacts of the Black Death? And obviously, all of this is just beyond a lot of people died. Why is that important? So let's look at urban society by the end of the Middle Ages. So for one thing, why do we see urbanization? Well, for the reasons I've already discussed. For example, we see the decline of serfdom. People have a lot more social and economic mobility. They can move where they'd like. So we do start to see kind of the rise of urbanization thanks to the decline of serfdom. But we also see that there's enough there's enough food to support people to not be farmers. So we do see that job specialization will occur because of improved crop yields. Excellent. But we also do see that cities are economically desirable because they offer these jobs that have wage work. So we do actually see that cities, which are centers of trade, are economic centers for people. And that's going to be kind of a pull factor of people going into cities. But what is kind of result from all this urbanization? Well, we do see the rise of new economic institutions to help facilitate trade. For example, we see the rise of guilds, and guilds are a kind of monopoly, you could say. Or oligarchy is probably the best term for this, in which we have leaders of certain professions meeting together and deciding what prices they set for their job. They decide what kind of process you go through to be a member of that profession. So there's a guild for every profession under the sun. There are bakers' guilds, so using that as an example. So bakers, master bakers, people who have gone through this apprenticeship program under these baker guilds, they own their own business. They meet with other bakers of the same city, and they set the standard for what you charge for bread. They set the standard for how you become a baker. So it's a very exclusionary process. Obviously, women and Jews are not allowed in all of this. And it's not a labor union. It's not kind of everyday wage workers getting together to decide these things. It's more like the people who own the bakery. So the business owners themselves, they set the standard, they price fix what their product is. So there are bakers' guilds, there are blacksmith guilds, there are shoemakers' guilds, there are guilds for everything and everyone other than Jews and women. In terms of other economic organizations, well, we do see kind of the rise of insurance to protect all of these merchants and their businesses. We see the rise of banking institutions to promote trade, to offer loans to people. But we also do see a decline in bartering. We do see, instead of just bartering goods, we do see kind of the reintroduction of currency into Western Europe. We see, for example, in northern Italy, the use of the florin. So Florence uses the florin. There's no coincidence. It's not, that is a coincidence, I should say. So we do see kind of the rise of new establishments of economic importance, insurance companies, banking institutions, of currencies by states. But what is all of this going to do to the society of Western Europe? Society of Western Europe. Well, for one thing, this increased focus on economic production is actually going to be yet another cultural cause for breaking the power of the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church, even though it is a arguably very corrupt institution during the end of the Middle Ages, as we'll see later in the Renaissance a little bit, and more in the Protestant Reformation, we do see that the Catholic Church and its views on the economy are coming under question during the late Middle Ages. So the Catholic Church is generally, kind of on paper at the very least, opposed to things like greed, and specifically the economic practice, the economic sin as well, of usury. And usury is basically charging very high interest for loans. However, because people are so interested in banking institutions, because they're so interested in facilitating trade, people are not going to listen to institutions that tend to block these motivations for economic incentive. So we do see a questioning of the Catholic Church's stance on usury. Banks need to charge interest in order for them to make a profit. So we do see that the Catholic Church and its social influence in the economy, that's going to largely decline by the end of the Middle Ages. And we also see the rise of the merchant class as well in many societies across Western Europe. And one could argue that these economic transformations, this improved focus on trade, the rise of the middle class, the rise of the merchant class, that is going to lead us into the development of capitalism. And capitalism, there's not really a date you can say that it started, but you could make the argument that it has its earliest origins in Europe by the end of the Middle Ages, and it will come into kind of the mainstream by the 1600s, definitely by the 1700s with the Industrial Revolution, as we'll see later. Let's also look at kind of the impact on urban societies. Well, for one thing, we are going to see that there are going to be a series of trading states across Europe, really. But the biggest area where we see urbanization for the purposes of trade is actually going to be northern Italy. So Italy, northern Italy anyway, is going to be kind of the most urbanized, most economically involved in trade parts of Western Europe during the end of the Middle Ages. So it's important to remember that Italy itself is not a unified country. It won't be until the 1800s. But there are a series of independent city-states that do come to dominate trade within Western Europe. For example, we have Venice and Florence. And these cities are very unique in that they have such an intense focus on merchant activity. The merchant class is able to participate in local government. And we see that through kind of alternative forms of government than just monarchy. We don't really see feudalism or nobles all that much in northern Italy. Instead, the dominant class are merchants. And we actually do see kind of institutions like republics. We see merchant republics in city-states across northern Italy. And that demonstrates kind of how important merchants are in these societies. Merchants have a vote, a say in their representative government. Venice is the best example of a Italian city-state with a, with a republic. They merchants anyway, wealthy men, they vote for representatives. And there's also kind of this figure known as a doge, who's basically the ruler of Venice, who's approved by this Republican body. But we also see in other city-states that really rich families like the Medici, are going to be very influential in local politics and the economy. So in Florence, for example, we have the Medici family, which are a very powerful banking family that is going to dominate Florentine politics It will influence artistic expression, as we'll see later. So we do see that one of the impacts of all of this increased wealth, as we'll talk about more in our next chapter, is that there's more money. And more money for rich people means they have time to buy and sponsor art, pretty stuff to put in their houses and in their cities in general. But we also do see economic activity outside of Italy. We also do see an increase of trade in northern Italy as well, or in northern Europe as well. For example, in the Low Countries and in Northwest Europe. So in terms of the Low Countries, we do see many city-states appear in regions like Flanders. So some city-states in Flanders include Brussels, Bruges, Ghent. In the Netherlands, we have Amsterdam is one of the biggest ones. So these are regions where we will have similar merchant republics, merchant-based city-states. So we do see that there is a increased importance of the merchant class in many societies in Northern Europe. In Flanders and Netherlands, these societies are dominated by merchants. There basically are no nobles. But we also do see that that city-states in Northern Europe, they're oftentimes going to get together and form economic communities. And we see that best expressed with the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League is a merchant confederacy of different city-states who have no kind of restrictions on trade between members of this Hanseatic League. So it's kind of like the EU in a way. Some people have compared it to that. It's one of the earliest economic communities. So it is going to be a series of city-states who don't have any restrictions against trade. There is no kind of tariff that blocks, no tax on trade, that blocks people from conducting business with one another. So we do see that in city-states in Northern Europe, in places like Amsterdam, which is in the region of the Netherlands, in cities like Brussels and Ghent, which are in the region of Flanders, we do see participation in trade and in trading communities like the Hanseatic League. But we also see non-city states involved in Northern European trade. For example, England, the Kingdom of England, is going to be involved in this trade. London becomes a major center of northern trade, especially with wool and textiles. We also see Scandinavia, they have wood and timber. We also see France involved. Paris becomes a major city at this time. Paris, of course, and France in general is exporting things like wine and cheese. But what's life like in these cities? Well, let's take a look at some cultural and social kind of institutions. Well, in terms of culture, we actually do see that many of these cities are going to see the rise of universities, of educational institutions. These universities aren't for everybody, they're just for rich people. But they are starting to appear thanks to this increased amount of wealth and intellectual diffusion from the rest of the world. So we do have trade, which means more money. More money means, hey, let's build a library. Let's build a university, for example. And by the way, kind of private individuals are saying that. Also governments are also saying that too. So we are going to see actually an increase of secular education during this time period. We do start to see this rise of secular universities. The church no longer dominates education through monasticism. So we do see this rise of secularism in education. But what's going on in terms of women and religious minorities? Well, let's first look at the religious minorities. Well, we do see that many medieval societies in Western Europe are going to largely be religiously intolerant towards minorities like Jews. Jews are going to be persecuted and targeted against in Christian communities across Western Europe. Jews are blamed for basically everything that goes wrong, the Black Death. They're blamed for the death of Jesus, even though that's not true. So we do see that Jews have limited political and economic rights. They have to live in special communities called ghettos. They have to be, they are exiled oftentimes from some places England basically kicks out all of its Jews at one point. So Jews do face persecution across medieval Europe. The status, however, excuse me, the exception, however, is Muslim Spain. Remember, Muslim societies generally were religiously tolerant, and Spain actually is the exception to is it okay to be a Jew in this country in the Middle Ages? That's going to change, however, because of the Christian invasions of Muslim Spain, the Reconquista. In terms of the status of women, well, you're going to be surprised to hear that women were subject to ideas of patriarchy. So, ideas that women had to be subservient to men, that wives had to be subservient to husbands, that children, obviously, to their parents, and in general, men to women. And largely, patriarchy, as we've seen in other societies, is backed up by religion. We see kind of these biblical descriptions of subservient women needing to kind of listen to their superiors, to their husbands and fathers. We see kind of this idea of chivalry from feudalism, that men have a responsibility to protect women because women are weak and frail, according to these medieval thinkers. Obviously, all of these things are not true, but that's what people thought at the time. And really, women only had two options for their society. They could either be a religious figure, they could be a celibate woman, priest, basically, a woman priest, that's a nun, or they could be a wife. Really, those are the two options. None of that thinking stuff for you ladies. No, 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 unless you're, a nun who is going to become educated, but you're still kind of subject to religious discrimination based on gender. In terms of art, well, this isn't going to be on the Unit 2 test, but it does help explain the transition to the Renaissance later. So by the end of the Middle Ages, we are going to start to see the rise of visual art that's not religious, that is secular. And in terms of literature, we start to see literature that is written in the vernacular, so written in the everyday language of people. So we see the rise of English literature, for example, instead of Latin-based things. So Latin is kind of no longer the predominant cultural language of Western Europe. And we generally call this period of medieval history in terms of art the Gothic period. It's a time of church architecture with flying buttresses and stained glass windows. It's a time of illuminated manuscripts. And I'll show some examples of these in a second. We also see that we have a rise in vernacular literature. So we can write things in stuff other than just Latin, but in the language of everyday people, the vernacular. So the sciences are still mostly preserved to Latin, education is Latin-based, but culture is generally swinging towards vernacular or non-Latin-based literature. So an example of English literature at this time is the Canterbury Tales. And this is what I mean by a Gothic church. This is a Gothic church, a picture of St. Michael's, actually, in Brussels. I took this picture. It's got stained glass windows. It's got these arches. It's very tall and elaborate. And this is what I mean by an illuminated manuscript. These are kind of images that happened, that were created by the end of the during the Middle Ages, and by the end of the Middle Ages especially, that do lack perspective. They do have very religious scenes most of the time. This is the Last Supper, Jesus's last dinner, and there's no perspective here. There's no kind of consideration of spacing or pacing, or yeah. I don't know anything about art really, but this is kind of a lack of perspective right here. Also, people couldn't draw anything in the Middle Ages, just kind of, in my opinion, just as a funny note. And they're also weirdly obsessed with snails. That's a shout out to last year, period 5. Anyway, yeah, they were hugely obsessed with snails. Anyway, so what is causing urbanization by the end of the Middle Ages? You should be able to answer that. And what are some results economically and socially? Let's wrap up today by looking at a general trend in places outside of these city-states. Let's look at the rise of nation-states and the rise of more centralized monarchies. So in general, by the end of the Middle Ages, these are trends that we are seeing. For one thing, We see the decline of medieval institutions, the Catholic Church being one of them, serfdom and feudalism being another, but also we do see the decline in the use of knights as well. Knights are going to be easily killed with new military technologies we'll talk about. In general, we do see kind of more powerful monarchs. These monarchs are going to have a lot more power to do things, as we'll see in the next slide. And this is going to lead to the rise of countries that are based on national identity rather than local identity. So we do see the rise of what we call nation states. These are societies that comprise a wider region, but they share a similar cultural and national identity. They speak the same language, they have the same national heroes. So we do see the rise of more centralized monarchies and the rise of larger states, the rise of nation states, places like France, England, and Spain. In general, we are kind of seeing a change up in the class dynamic. We do see increasingly merchants are becoming a bigger deal in Western Europe. And we also do see a decline in the military powers, especially of the nobility. Nobles are basically going to not have their traditional military roles anymore, for the most part. We do see that nobles do have political influence still, and that's going to be true in Western Europe until the what is it called? The French Revolution and World War One. Until the French Revolution, until the French Revolution. So we do see that the nobility still are the dominant social class, but they are facing competition from an emerging merchant class. So these are people who are rich, but aren't nobles necessarily. And we call kind of nobles that retain political power. These are the nobles of the scroll. They oftentimes are in charge of administration for a king, for a monarch. And in general, we are seeing kind of the rise excuse me, we are seeing the rise of new monarchs. And a new monarch is this new type of king or queen, and there's some examples of queens too, who generally have more centralized authority that oftentimes is coming at the expense of the nobility. So we see that new monarchs are going to centralize their power through a variety of different means. For one thing, they're going to have more power to tax their nobles. They're going to gain that power. They're going to kind of enforce unity in their nation by having religious conformity. We see that the nobles themselves, they are no longer going to be the ones in charge of raising armies. They are going to merely kind of be viewed in ceremonial terms. So instead, we do have armies that are raised directly by monarchs and that are loyal to the monarch themselves and not some noble. We also see the use of new military technologies, gunpowder being the most unique of them. But we also see that new monarchs are going to encourage centralization by promoting national identities, by promoting national heroes, by promoting flags and shared symbols. And yet, at the same time, it is important to understand that the nobility still retain their political role in Western Europe. We are going to see that nobles do have rights reserved for them. The Magna Carta is an example of that. The kind of need for permission to increase taxes by bodies like Parliament and the Estates General. Those are also demonstrations of powers that the nobility still have. So let's look at the best examples of the places where we will see new monarchs. So in places like France and England, we do see the rise of new monarchs thanks primarily to the 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War is actually going to see the kings of France and England are going to assume more political power for themselves. So for one thing, we are going to see stronger militaries because of the inclusion of new technologies like gunpowder. Gunpowder obviously is going to lead to the development of cannons and muskets, and that's going to make knights obsolete. You can shoot a knight on a horse. We have longbows, which also are going to kill off knights. We have the use of pikes, which will kill the horses that knights ride on. But we also see that through the Hundred Years' War, we will have demonstrations of national symbols. For example, in England, we have the heroic figure of King Henry V. Henry V is going to lead the English in a victory at the Battle of Agincourt, and that's going to be kind of viewed as a symbol of English national identity. Look, we have a shared common hero who we can all look up to as Englishmen. And then France also has their national hero of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, a peasant lady who will eventually, or a peasant woman, not a lady, because a lady is a noble. Haha. A peasant noble, a peasant woman who is going to lead the French to victory at a battle in Orleans. She's viewed as a martyr for the French nation because she is eventually killed by the English monarchy. She's accused of being a witch. So we do kind of see that people feel devoted to a nation rather than just an individual community. They have kind of these shared symbols, shared heroes that they look up to and respect. There are symbols of national identity and flags. The flag of France at this time is white. So we are going to see kind of new national symbols emerging. People are identifying with their nation rather than just their community, their independent local community. But we also do see that the Hundred Years' War will increase the power to tax by French and English nobles. We do kind of see that the kings of France and England, they're going to heavily use bodies like Parliament and the Estates General to increase taxes on the nobles to pay for this war. And some examples of English and French new monarchs include Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. We'll briefly talk about her more later on. We also see the figure of, oh my God. What's the guy's name? That French dude. Henry VI. There we go. So we do kind of see new French monarchs as well. All right, so let's go over to Spain. And the two most important new monarchs in Spain that are going to kind of demonstrate this increased centralized power are going to be Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand and Isabella were king and queen of two different countries in Spain before they got married. And in 1469, we do see that this dynastic marriage will merge these two kingdoms together, meaning there's more centralized authority in the hands of joint rulers, Ferdinand and Isabella. But Ferdinand and Isabella are going to ensure Spanish national unity by having religious conformity, by having religious unity. So we are going to see that unity is expressed through the promotion of everybody needing to be Catholic. So the Catholic Church is going to kind of become another wing of the Spanish government, of the Spanish monarchy. So the Spanish monarchy and the Catholic Church are working close together, but at the end of the day, it's the monarchy that's more powerful than the Catholic Church in Spain. And the Catholic rulers of Spain are going to ensure conformity through conquering Spain. They are going to kick out the remaining Muslim presence in Spain as at the end of the Reconquista. And the Reconquista actually is going to conclude in 1492 when Spanish Muslims are going to be kicked out of Spain after the Battle of Granada. But another way that the Spanish are enforcing conformity is through the use of the Inquisition. And this is going to lead us to the famous, or infamous, I should say, Spanish Inquisition. So an Inquisition is a body made up by the Catholic Church to root out people who aren't Catholic or are heretics. And the Spanish government is going to kind of use the Inquisition to establish that in order to be Spanish, you've got to be a good old Catholic. So we do see that the Spanish monarchy, the Spanish Catholic Church, are going to target Jews, Muslims, even people who converted to Christianity from Judaism or Islam, conversos. So we do see that there is very kind of brutal methods to ensure that everyone is being a good old Catholic. There's torture, exiling, there's executions. It's a very brutal kind of system to enforce religious unity. And of course, we have this Monty Python sketch, but you're not going to watch that right now. Stop. All right. So you should be able to answer this question right here. What factors led to the rise of centralization, the rise of nation states by the end of the Middle Ages? So think about kind of the rise of new monarchs and define what a new monarch is doing to centralize power. That's how you would answer this question here. All right, thank you very much. That was all for chapter 8. I hope you enjoyed learning about death and destruction. That's really the subjects of units 2, really, of unit 2. Awesome, Sawsome, Apple Possum. Have a great day. Goodbye.